Beneath 1,000 candles, the richest girl in the county stood alone. Her gown shimmered like spun gold, her engagement ring caught the light, and the most admired gentleman in Kansas laughed across the room with a stranger's wife. Adeline Ashford pressed her gloved knuckles to her lips. From the kitchen doorway, a flour-dusted cook watched her not weep. Months earlier, in the gray hour before dawn, Eli Turner carried kindling through the Ashford kitchen and overheard the housekeeper scolding a scullery girl for crying over a broken dish. "Worth isn't in the porcelain," Eli said quietly, kneeling to gather shards. "It's in whether somebody notices you're hurting." The girl blinked at him. The housekeeper sniffed and walked off, but the words settled into the warm kitchen air like the smell of rising bread, and Eli, who owned nothing, believed them more than any man in that grand house believed his fortune. The Ashford estate sat on 400 acres of black Kansas soil, the finest land in the county, and Cornelius Ashford had built upon it a house with 2 staircases, 14 rooms, and a ballroom that could swallow a barn. He had built it for his daughter, though he rarely said so. Adeline had grown up inside its grandeur the way a pearl grows inside a shell, polished, protected, and lonely. She knew the names of every servant and the favorite hymn of the woman who pressed her dresses. She did not know how to be seen as anything but an heiress. Eli came to the household in autumn, hired into the kitchen after the old cook's hands failed him. He had grown up 40 miles west on land that gave up nothing easily, learning to coax flavor from turnips and to stretch a single chicken across a family of 9. He worked before the sun and after it set, and he asked for little. The other servants liked him because he never put himself above them, and the kitchen staff loved him because he learned every name and remembered every birthday. He noticed Adeline first, not as a fortune, but as a sadness. He saw how she lingered at the kitchen door some evenings, drawn by the warmth and the laughter of working people. He saw how she straightened her shoulders before entering rooms, the way a soldier braces. He saw that her fiance, Bennett Crane, handsome, celebrated, the catch of 3 counties, looked at her the way a man looks at a deed of property. Bennett was charming to everyone and devoted to no one. He arrived at the estate in fine coats and left a trail of admiring glances. Cornelius approved of him because the Crane name was old and the match would bind 2 great families. Adeline had said yes because she had been raised to, and because no one had ever taught her that she was allowed to want more. She mistook her father's relief for her own happiness, and she carried the engagement like a beautiful, heavy coat she could not figure out how to remove. The wedding was set for spring. The engagement ball was set for that very Saturday, the night the whole county would come to watch the heiress shine. The ball arrived gold and glittering. Carriages lined the drive, the orchestra tuned, the ballroom filled with silk and perfume, and the bright chatter of people who had never wanted for anything. Adeline descended the grand staircase to a hush of admiration, and for one moment she believed the night might be wonderful. Then Bennett kissed her hand, murmured something about fetching punch, and did not return. From the foot of the stairs she watched him drift to a cluster of laughing young women, watched him lean close, watched him be exactly the man everyone adored, to everyone but her. An hour passed, the music swelled, and Adeline Ashford stood alone in the center of her own celebration, smiling so no one would see the truth, while in the kitchen each plated quail and happened to glance through the open door. Eli told himself it was none of his concern. He was a cook. She was the daughter of the house, engaged to a gentleman, surrounded by 200 guests. A man in his position learned early where the lines were drawn, and they were drawn thick and bright between the kitchen and the ballroom. He returned to his work, arranging roasted vegetables along a silver platter, and tried to forget the look on her face. But the look would not leave him. He had seen that particular kind of aloneness before, not the absence of people, but the absence of being known by any of them. He had seen it in his own mother, widowed young, working herself thin while neighbors praised her strength, and never once asked if she was tired. He had seen it in the scullery girl that gray morning. It was the loneliness of the persons everyone admired and no one comforted. He glanced out again. Bennett was now near the windows, his hand light on another woman's arm, his head thrown back in laughter. And Adeline had not moved. She stood beneath the largest chandelier with a glass of untouched punch, her chin high, her eyes too bright. As Eli watched, she pressed her gloved knuckles to her mouth and turned slightly away, the small private gesture of someone swallowing tears in public. The platter trembled in his hands. He set it down. It would be foolish to go to her. He knew that. The guests would stare. The housekeeper would have words for him tomorrow. Cornelius Ashford might dismiss him outright, and a dismissal without reference would put him back on the road with winter coming. He had a younger brother depending on the wages he sent home. One impulsive act of kindness could cost two people their bread. And what could he even offer her? He had no fine words, no title, nothing but flour on his shirt and the smell of wood smoke in his sleeves. She would likely be embarrassed by him. The whole room would laugh. But then he thought of his own words, spoken months ago over broken porcelain. Worth lay in whether somebody noticed you were hurting. He had said it as though he believed it. Did he? Or had it only been an easy thing to say to a crying girl, costing him nothing? A man's principles, he decided, were worth exactly as much as he was willing to pay for them. He looked at the plate of warm food in his hands. He looked at the lonely girl beneath the lights, and he understood that some prices were worth paying, even when the bill came due all at once. Eli took a clean plate. He chose carefully a portion of the tender quail, the roasted vegetables glazed and steaming, a soft roll still warm from the oven, the small honeyed tart he had made that very afternoon, and set aside, not knowing why. He arranged them the way he would for someone he loved, then wiped his hands on his apron, knowing the apron itself was hopeless. He did not change his shirt. There was no time, and besides, hiding what he was would have been its own kind of lie. Flour on the sleeve, smoke in the weave, and a warm plate in his hands, he stepped out of the kitchen and into the blazing light of the ballroom, where 200 of the finest people in Kansas turned one by one to stare. The first person to truly see what Eli was doing was Mabel Quick, the estate's head seamstress, stationed discreetly near the cloakroom in case a hem tore. She was 60 years old, sharp as a pin, and she had watched Adeline grow from a solemn child into a solemn woman. She had also watched Bennett Crane for the better part of a year, and formed opinions she kept behind her teeth. When Mabel saw the cook cross the marble floor toward the heiress, she did not gasp like the others. She set down her sewing, folded her hands, and smiled the smile of a woman who has waited a long time to see someone do the right thing out loud. Adeline became aware of him by the change in the room's sound, the way conversation guttered like candle flame in a draft. She turned, expecting Bennett, expecting her father, expecting anyone who belonged. Instead, she found a young man in a stained white shirt, his dark hair damp at the temples from kitchen heat, holding a plate of food and looking at her with an expression she could not place because she had never been on the receiving end of it. It was not admiration, it was not deference, it was concern. "Miss Ashford," he said, low enough for her alone. "You haven't eaten. I thought you might be hungry." For a moment she could not speak. Around them the silence spread in rings. She saw, at the edge of her vision, a dozen faces frozen in delighted scandal, fans lifting to hide whispers. She knew exactly how this looked. The dirty cook, the daring breach, the heiress accosted at her own ball by a servant who had forgotten his place. Heat climbed her neck. The old training told her to be cold, to wave him off, to summon someone to remove him and restore the proper order of things. But she looked at the plate. He had cut the quail already, she realized. Cut it into small, manageable pieces, the way you would prepare food for someone you did not want to see struggle with a knife while people watched. He had chosen things that could be eaten quietly, with dignity, without mess. There was a cloth napkin folded beneath the roll. The whole arrangement was an act of attention so precise, so quietly thoughtful, that it undid her completely. No one had paid attention to her all night. No one had paid real attention to her in years. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli inclined his head and stepped back, intending to vanish the way servants were meant to vanish. But Adeline, to her own astonishment, to the ballroom's gasping delight, reached out and caught the edge of his sleeve. "Stay," she said. "Please, just a moment." The whisper became a murmur, became a low roar. She heard her name in it and his absence of one. She did not care. She held the plate he had given her and felt, for the first time that endless evening, that she was a person and not a centerpiece. "You're the cook," she said. Eli Turner. "You know my name." He seemed genuinely surprised. "I know everyone's name." She managed a small, real smile. "I just didn't think anyone knew mine. Not the real one." He understood her instantly, the way no one in silk had understood her all night. "The Ashford heiress," he said gently, "versus the woman standing here." Yes, her eyes stung. Exactly that. Across the room, Bennett had finally noticed. He extracted himself from his admirers with the irritation of a man whose property had been touched. He came toward them with a fixed smile and hard eyes, and the crowd parted to give him a clear view of the spectacle. His bride, holding a plate, standing close to a flour-stained kitchen boy. "Adeline," Bennett said pleasantly, dangerously, "what on earth is this?" She lifted her chin. Something had shifted in her in the last 3 minutes. Some small fixed thing had come loose. "This," she said, "is Mr. Turner. He noticed I hadn't eaten, which is more than I can say for my fiancée, who noticed only that I was being spoken to." A ripple went through the listeners. Bennett's smile thinned. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said quietly. "Send him back to the kitchen. I asked him to stay." "Adeline, you left me standing alone for over an hour," she said, and though her voice shook, it carried. "At our engagement ball. In front of everyone. And the only person in this entire house who thought to ask whether I was all right was the man you want me to send away." Bennett laughed, the easy, golden laugh that had charmed 3 counties, and turned it on the crowd like a lantern, inviting them to share the joke. "She's overwrought," he announced warmly. "Ladies do tire at these long evenings. Surely you'll all forgive a moment of nerves before a wedding." A few sympathetic chuckles answered him. He had a gift for making his own cruelty sound like everyone's good sense. Then he looked at Eli, and the warmth drained out of his face. "As for you," he said, "you've made a serious mistake. A man in your position lays hands on nothing above his station. You'll be gone by morning, and you'll be lucky to find a barn that'll take you after I've made some calls." Eli did not flinch. He had expected this from the moment he lifted the plate. "That may be," he said evenly, "but I'd do it again. Miss Ashford was hurting, and not one of you fine people lifted a finger. I'm only a cook, sir, but where I come from, you don't let a person stand alone in a crowded room and call it manners." The murmur changed pitch. It was no longer purely scandalized. Somewhere in it now ran a thread of something else. A few guests glancing at Bennett, at the women he'd been laughing with, doing quiet arithmetic about how the evening had actually gone. Mabel Quick, by the cloakroom, said clearly to no one and everyone, "The cook's got more breeding than the groom." It was not loud. It did not need to be. It traveled. Bennett's composure cracked. "Who said that?" No one answered. He rounded on Adeline. "Do you hear how they talk? Do you see what he's done to your reputation? Take my arm, smile, and we'll put this right. Defy me in front of the county, and you'll regret it the rest of your life." It was meant as persuasion. It landed as a threat, and everyone heard it land. Adeline looked at the man she was supposed to marry, handsome, admired, furious that a servant had revealed him. Then she looked at Eli, who stood with flour on his shirt and his chin level, having just thrown away his living to tell the truth about her pain. The contrast was so stark, so total, that she wondered how she had ever been blind to it. But blindness, she was learning, was the easiest thing in the world when you had been raised inside it. She had been taught that the polished man was the good man, that titles measured worth, that a servant's kindness was beneath notice and a gentleman's neglect was simply the way of things. The whole architecture of her life leaned on those beliefs. To pull one out was to feel the rest groan. Her father appeared at the edge of the crowd. Cornelius Ashford, gray and substantial, took in the scene. His daughter, the cook, the affronted Crane heir, 200 witnesses, and his face went dark with the particular anger of a man watching his careful plans tip toward ruin. "Adeline," he said, in the voice that had ended every argument of her childhood, "come away from there now." And the room held its breath to see which man the heiress would obey. Adeline looked at her father, then at Bennett, then down at the warm plate in her hands, the honeyed tart, the carefully cut quail, the folded napkin. The whole weight of her upbringing pulled her toward the staircase, toward the proper match, toward the life that had been arranged for her like furniture in a room she'd never been asked to decorate. "No," she said. The word fell into the ballroom like a dropped crystal. 200 people heard the heiress refuse her father in his own house. "I'll not come away," she said, steadier now. "I've come away from myself for 20 years. I won't do it again tonight. Not for a match, not for the county, not for a man who couldn't be bothered to bring me a glass of water." The consequences arrived swiftly, as consequences do when a great deal of money and pride are involved. Cornelius Ashford did not shout. Shouting was for men with less power. He crossed the floor with terrible calm, took his daughter by the elbow, and steered her toward the library, off the ballroom, signaling the orchestra to resume with a flick of his hand. Music stumbled back to life. The guests pretended to dance and strained to listen. In the library, with the door cracked and Bennett following uninvited, Cornelius released her arm. "Have you lost your mind?" he said. It was not a question. "Do you understand what you've done? You've humiliated Bennett Crane in front of every family that matters in this county. You've taken the word of a kitchen hand over your own father's judgment. The Crane alliance is the single most important thing this family has arranged in a generation, and you have set fire to it over a plate of food. He left me alone, father. Men of standing have their own ways at these affairs. You were raised better than to make a scene over so small a thing." "Small," Adeline's voice cracked. "You weren't out there. You didn't see him laughing while I stood under the lights like a prize nobody came to claim." Bennett stepped forward smoothly. "Cornelius, I'm willing to overlook tonight. Nerves, as I said. We'll announce nothing's changed. The girl will rest. And by the wedding, this will be a forgotten thing." He turned to Adeline, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "Won't it, my dear? You'll apologize to me and to the cook's master for the disruption. And we'll see the man dismissed quietly, and all will be as it was." "Dismissed for what?" she demanded. "For kindness? For overstepping. He knew the risk." "Then he's braver than you, because he took it for a stranger, and you wouldn't cross a ballroom for the woman you claim to want to marry." The two men exchanged a glance, the glance of allies who have realized their problem is larger than they thought. Cornelius rubbed his temple. "Adeline, I have given you everything, this house, your gowns, a future secured. I ask one thing in return, that you make a good marriage and stop embarrassing me. Is that so much?" And there it was, the bill for a lifetime of comfort presented at last. She had always sensed dimly that her gilded life had a price, and now she saw it itemized. Her obedience, her silence, her willingness to marry a man who saw her as a holding. The gowns and the staircases and the 400 acres had never been gifts. They had been a down payment on her cooperation. She looked at her father, whom she loved, whose approval she had hungered for all her life, and felt the terrible loneliness of understanding that he had never quite seen her either. Only the shape of her, the useful, marriageable, daughter-shaped space she was meant to fill. "I'll think on it," she said finally, because she was not yet brave enough for the whole truth, and because she needed time. Cornelius took it as surrender and softened at once. "Good girl, go and rest. Bennett, give her the night." He opened the library door. "We'll repair this in the morning." But the morning brought worse. not better. Word of the ball had spread through the county by breakfast the way fire spreads through dry grass. The story told in the finer houses was not flattering to Adeline. The Ashford girl had thrown a tantrum at her own engagement and let a servant make. A fool of her intended. Bennett, wounded and gracious, was the hero of every retelling. By noon, 3 different matrons had called on Cornelius to commiserate, and each visit hardened his resolve. Eli, meanwhile, had been confined to the kitchen and informed by the housekeeper, not unkindly, for she liked him, that his dismissal was being arranged. "Mr. Crane's pressing for it," she murmured, "needing dough she didn't need to knead. And the master won't cross him. You'll have your wages through the week." After that, she didn't finish. After that meant the road and winter and a younger brother whose schooling depended on money that would stop. "I know," Eli said. He did not regret it. But knowing a thing is right does not make it cost less. Adeline found him there in the late afternoon, having slipped from a house full of people managing her future without her. She stood in the kitchen doorway where she had so often lingered, and the warm, familiar smell of it nearly broke her. "They're sending you away," she said. "Tomorrow, I expect. Because of me. Because of me." He looked up from the bread. "I made the choice, Miss Ashford. Don't carry it. I knew the cost, and I paid it gladly, and I'd not unspend it now." "Why?" The question burst out of her. "Why would you do that for someone you don't even know? You've lost your living." He was quiet a moment, shaping the dough. "My mother raised me alone after my father passed," he said. "Folks called her strong, praised her for it at church every Sunday. And every Sunday she came home and cried where she thought I couldn't hear, because being praised for carrying something heavy isn't the same as somebody helping you carry it." He set the loaf in the pan. "I swore I'd never look at a person breaking and call it none of my business. That's all. It isn't grand. It's just the one thing I've got that nobody can dismiss me from." Adeline stood in the doorway with tears running freely now, and understood that this man, who owned nothing, had handed her the most valuable thing anyone ever had. The simple, radical act of treating her as though her pain mattered, and she was about to let her father and Bennett take even his livelihood for it. "I won't let them," she said, but she did not yet know how to stop them. And the machinery of the county, money, reputation, 2 powerful men, and the whole weight of how things were done, was already grinding toward a conclusion, in which the cook left in disgrace and the heiress married as planned. That evening, Cornelia summoned her to announce that matters were settled. The Crane wedding would proceed. A public reconciliation would be staged at church on Sunday. The cook would be gone by dawn, with a warning sent ahead to every house in 3 counties to ensure he found no respectable work. "It's kindest this way," her father said. "Clean. Final." Adeline returned to her room and sat in the dark. The plate Eli had brought her sat on her dressing table, washed and returned by the kitchen staff. She had kept it. Now it seemed only a small white circle of failure, proof that one good man had reached for her and that her own world had risen up to crush him for it. She did not light a candle. She sat with the empty plate in her lap and let the dark hold her, and for a long while she believed there was nothing to be done. She was one woman. They were money and custom and her own beloved, immovable father. Every door she could imagine opening led back to the same room. The marriage, the silence, the life arranged for her like a place setting. She thought of running. But run to what, with no money of her own, no skill the world rewarded, nothing but a name that belonged more to her father than to her. She thought of pleading, but she had pleaded already, and pleading was a coin that bought nothing in that house. And then, slowly in the dark, a different thought arrived. Not a loud one, but steady, like Eli's voice over the broken porcelain months ago. She had spent the whole night believing she had only 2 choices: obey or be destroyed. But that was the heiress's arithmetic, the math of a woman who owned nothing because she had never tried to own anything. Eli had owned one thing they could not take: his principles and his willingness to pay for them out loud, in front of everyone. He had stood in the most public room in the county and simply told the truth, and the truth had moved. She'd heard it move, heard the murmur change, seen guests do their quiet arithmetic about Bennett. The county ran on reputation. Reputation ran on what people were willing to say in public. She had been raised to fear the crowd, but the crowd had a conscience, and tonight it had nearly turned. What if she stopped whispering in libraries and did her arguing where everyone could hear, the way the cook had? She set the plate down. Her hands had stopped shaking. She knew now what to do, and it frightened her more than running ever could, because it could not be taken back. She would not flee, and she would not plead in private where her father's power was absolute. She would do what Eli had done. She would stand in the most public place she could find and tell the simple truth out loud, and trust that the same conscience that had stirred in the ballroom would stir again in the open air, where money could not so easily smother it. Sunday was coming. The whole county would be at church. They expected a reconciliation. She would give them a reckoning instead, and this time she would not stand alone. She moved that night while her courage was hot. First, the kitchen. She found Eli banking the fire for the last time, his small bundle of belongings already packed by the door. When she told him what she meant to do, he set down the poker and looked at her for a long moment. "You'll spend your whole standing in this county on it," he said. "Maybe lose it for good. You understand that?" "I spent 20 years buying my father's approval, and it turned out he was never selling me anything but a leash." She held his gaze. "I'd rather spend what's left of my reputation on the truth. You taught me that. It's worth exactly what you'll pay for it." She paused. "But I won't do it without you standing there. Not because I need rescuing, because you saw me first and the county should see that. Will you stay through Sunday?" He should have said no. Staying meant facing Bennett's malice with no wages and no protection. But he looked at this woman who 3 days ago could not have crossed a room for herself, and was now proposing to cross the entire county, and he found he could not leave before he saw how it ended. "I'll stay," he said. Then the harder visit. She woke her father near midnight and told him plainly that she would not marry Bennett Crane, that she would say so in public if forced, and that she would explain to anyone who asked exactly why. The hour alone beneath the chandelier, the laughter, the kindness that came only from the kitchen. Cornelius raged. He threatened. He invoked the family name, the money, the ruin she'd bring. She did not bend, and somewhere in his fury she saw the first flicker of something new in his eyes. Not anger, but the dawning, uncomfortable suspicion that he had badly misjudged the matter and his daughter. Sunday came clear and cold. The county packed the white clapboard church to witness the famous reconciliation. Bennett stood near the front in a fine new coat, gracious and golden, already the hero of the tale. Cornelius sat rigid in the family pew, and Eli stood at the very back, flour washed away for once, in his single, clean shirt, having been told by Adeline exactly where to be. When the moment came for the families to make their gracious public peace, Adeline rose. But she did not go to Bennett. She walked to the front, turned to face the assembled county. Every matron who'd gossiped, every gentleman who'd laughed, and spoke in a voice that did not shake. "You've come for a reconciliation," she said. "I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. There won't be a wedding." The church inhaled as one. "You've heard a story this week about a foolish girl who made a scene. Let me give you the true one. At my engagement ball, the man I was to marry left me standing alone for over an hour while he flattered other women. I stood under the lights of my father's house and tried not to weep, and not one fine person in that crowd of 200 crossed the floor to ask if I was well." She let it land. "One person did. A cook, a man you'd call beneath me. He brought me a warm plate and a kind word, and the simple decency of being seen. And for that act you laughed at him, and these gentlemen arranged to ruin him." She found Bennett's face, white now beneath its polish. "I'll not marry a man who saw me only as an acreage to acquire, and I'll not let the one person who treated me as a soul be driven onto the road in winter for it." She turned to the congregation, and here her voice gentled. You run this county on what's said in public, so I'm saying it in public. Kindness is worth more than a coat. A man who notices your pain is worth more than one who notices your dowry. I learned that from someone with flour on his sleeves, and I'd sooner share a kitchen with him than a mansion with anyone who'd let me cry alone. The silence held one heartbeat, two, and then Mabel Quick, in the third pew, stood up and began deliberately to applaud. An old farmer joined her, then a young woman who had been one of those laughing at the ball and had felt ashamed of it ever since. Then a dozen more, then the half of the room that had done its quiet arithmetic and reached the same sum. Bennett Crane looked about for his admirers and found them studying their hymnals, and he understood at last that the golden story was no longer his to tell. He left before the applause finished. No one stopped him. Cornelius Ashford sat very still through all of it. Then he rose, and the church braced for thunder. Instead, the old man walked to the front, looked at his daughter as though seeing her truly for the first time, and said, low and rough, I have been a fool about a great many things, chief among them what you were worth. He turned to the back of the church to Eli. Mr. Turner, I owe you my daughter's tears noticed when I did not notice them. Come to dinner, not through the kitchen door. A year later, in the gray hour before dawn, two people moved together through a warm kitchen. Not the grand Ashford one, but their own. In a modest house on good land, Cornelius had helped them buy and never once called a favor. Flour dusted both their sleeves now. Adeline measured. Eli kneaded. Bread rose in the steady heat. She had learned his trade because she'd wanted to, and found in it the plain dignity no ballroom ever offered. Outside, the sky paled toward gold. She was seen, and she had never once been alone.